Welcome everyone. I'm just going to give it a minute or so for everyone in the waiting room to join, and then I'll get started in a minute. Cool. So I think that's for everyone who's in the waiting room has joined now. So welcome to the fifth Jumping Rivers webinar. This is Accessible Shiny, designing for all users. My name is Osheen MacOscar, and I'm a data scientist and trainer at Jumping Rivers. If this is your first webinar with us, then uh, I'd like to introduce you to Jumping Rivers. We are a data science consultancy based in the northeast of England, and we do pretty much anything within the data science space and also training as well in languages like R and Python, from introductory level all the way up to some of the more advanced techniques. We also do machine learning, DevOps infrastructure, and managed POSIT services, so POSIT deployments and things like that as well, along with pretty much anything in the R space. So a lot of shiny dashboards and things like that. A little bit of promo as well before we get started. So we have our next conference coming up in June 2026. That's the 4th and 5th of June in Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England, and it's all about AI. We've got a few talks announced so far, but stay tuned for more updates on that. We'll also be running a few workshops that'll be really great. We also have the Northeast Data Science Meetup that we host. The next iteration of this is on the 29th of January next year. And we also host the Leeds Data Science Meetup, and that'll be on the 20th of January next year. Stay tuned to hear about more webinars as well for 2026. We haven't released a lineup yet, but I think that'll be coming out. About this webinar, so this is my first one, so I'm just getting used to the Q&A button and section. But if you have any questions throughout this, just drop it in the Q&A and I'll try and get around to it. We'll have about 10 minutes at the end of the session to discuss. So, accessible shiny, that's what we're here to talk about. So, this talk is titled Designing for All Users, and I've got a bit of background first. So, at the end of this webinar, I hope you know the answer to all these questions. So, what is accessibility? Just quickly now, accessibility is really just designing for all users. We want our Shiny apps and dashboards and websites to be accessible to everyone. We don't want certain users not to be able to interact with a widget, or certain users to not be able to even get onto a tab or get onto a page. So that's what accessibility is all about. Why do we need it? So, going off what I've just said, you want all of the users of your apps and dashboards to be able to access the whole thing. Otherwise, it's not going to be fair and they'll be missing out. And as a developer, you'll be doing things wrong. Who does this impact? You might think that accessibility tools don't impact you, or they're only for other people, but it actually impacts everyone. So if you ever used captions on a video, or if you've ever broken your wrist and can't use a keyboard and you have to use a tab and you can't use a mouse, then these tools will be useful to you. Where can you find out more about this? So Jumping Rivers has a few blogs on accessibility already, and the WCAG guidelines, WCAG guidelines are the source of truth for all things web accessibility, and I'll show that page later on in the talk. And then what I hope to cover in this talk is how we can actually implement it, and specifically in our Shiny apps. Accessibility is a massive topic, and implementing it in the Shiny apps is also quite a big topic. So in this webinar, I'm just going to be covering alt text and maybe a little bit of ARIA as well. So this topic is way too big to talk about in 45 minutes or an hour. So if you are interested in this, then if you drop me or Jumping Rivers an email, we have a whole training course on this, and also have done some consultancy projects on this in the past. So we are quite experienced. So going back a long time now, websites used to look something like this. I've just embedded it in the quarter slides, but they used to look something like this, where they're quite simple. All we can really include is images, different levels of text, a bit of color, links, and I think that's about it. You don't really see any websites that look like this anymore, which is a good and a bad thing. This type of website is actually pretty good for accessibility, as there's not much interactivity and not much you can do on this. Some websites, like the BBC and the government websites, are pretty good for web accessibility, but you'll notice there that they don't actually include that much interactivity or complication. It's just simple, and that's because they have to meet a lot of the guidelines around accessibility. As things moved on and got more complicated, we have tools like SCSS and JavaScript, which allow us to have interactive and really cool visualizations embedded in websites, like this little example we've got here, where wherever I click my mouse, there'll be a little explosion and it'll change color. So it's a long way from the websites that look like this. I'm sure you've all seen some really complicated websites where there's a lot of cool things going on, and that's where the new tools have come in. But it's also brought around new challenges around accessibility. Which how can we make everything on our website or on our app accessible to all users? Even within the data science space, we can now make and embed very easily in apps and dashboards 3D interactive visualizations like this plot of a volcano in New Zealand. And again, it's going to be a new challenge to try and make this accessible to everyone who's using the apps or dashboards that you deploy. So yeah, complication and new tools like web access, like SCSS and JavaScript, and new different interactive visualizations have brought new issues. So the growing complexity can create barriers for assistive technologies. If you're just a keyboard user, for example, it's going to be quite hard, and you're going to have to be quite inventive to use or interact with this in a way that someone who has a mouse will. There's also custom non-standard UI elements that can break keyboard and screen reader access. And the newer visual heavy designs can actually reduce clarity, contrast, and overall usability. So it's going to be actually harder if you've got some kind of vision impairment to see or interact with the websites. If you've got a widget, some of the default ones in Shiny actually don't meet the guidelines on contrast. So think of I think a slider bar is one of the examples where there's not actually enough contrast around the part that you're interacting with. A rough plan for what I'm going to cover in the next 40 minutes or so is a little bit of an introduction to accessibility. I'm then going to be covering alt text, so what it is and why it matters for accessibility and how to control it in your Shiny apps, and then a little bit of ARIA at the end as well. So, introduction to accessibility, and we've just got a few slides showing some common accessibility solutions and problems. So, for example, a person with low vision or complete loss of sight, the problems they may encounter are unable to read the text, they may not be able to see the images, or they may not be able to see the videos in your app or website. And the solutions for these three are a screen reader for any text or images that they can see. On those images, there must be alt text, which is what we're going to cover first, for the screen reader to be able to read out something of use to someone using a screen reader. And for videos, we'll need to provide audio descriptions on those videos. If you haven't heard of or used a screen reader before, what it will do is when you open a page on a computer or on a phone, if it's turned on, it will just start reading out the content of that page. So on this slide, it would start with common accessibility solutions and then proceed to read a person with low vision or complete loss of sight and then read through the table. If it's on an app or a website, it will actually also read out any specified elements like buttons or links that will lead to another page or some type of action. A person with partial or total hearing loss, they may not be able to hear the audio in videos, and a solution to this could be providing subtitles in the videos or audio transcriptions for videos and sound clips that play. So making sure something's in place so they'll be able to gain information from that as well. Another common accessibility solution is for a person with loss of motor function, may not be able to accurately control a mouse or a touchscreen. And in this case, the common solution is to allow that user to navigate and interact with the app or website using a keyboard or a similar button type interface. And lots of these accessibility devices exist. So the tab is the most common button, sometimes shift as well to go backwards, but or the keys. But in some cases, the devices are quite limited in what they can do, so we need to accommodate for that as well. There is also differences between permanent and temporary accessibility solutions. So not all accessibility requirements arise from permanent conditions. For example, if you've broken your wrist, as I said earlier, uh, on your dominant hand, it's going to be more difficult to use a mouse. My mouse is actually a right-handed mouse as well, so even I'd have to get a new mouse if I was unable to use my right hand. Or even if you forgot to bring headphones with you to watch a video on a packed bus where you're unable to listen to the volume, then you're going to need to use captions or something, another kind of accessibility solution. So, as I said, these solutions are for everyone and they are going to help, even if you're a user that would like just to use your keyboard and don't really like using a mouse, then this is going to affect you. As I mentioned earlier as well, the accessibility guidelines, the WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, are the kind of source of truth for web accessibility. There's a few sets of guidelines which I can go into, go off full screen, go on to this. There's three different conformance levels going from A being the lowest to AAA, which is being the highest. There's guidelines for pretty much anything you can think of for a website or web app. So text alternatives like alt text, different adaptable and distinguishable for different levels of contrast and what you should do with the size of text. There's also an operable section, which is all about how users are going to navigate your website or app with keyboards. There's also timing things as well. So if your website's going to time out after a certain amount of time, or there must be adequate warnings for this, and also the ability to like extend sessions and that type of thing. Understandable as well. Now, this is another section, and then robust and conformance as well. And for each guideline, there's going to be different levels of what you can do. So for level A, there's these guidelines, and then all the way down to the highest level, which is AAA, the guidelines are going to be a little bit more strict. So this is the best place to look for anything web accessibility, and that's the W3 Web Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short. So moving on to our first section, which is alt text. It's short for alternative text, and what it means is just providing, as it says on the tin, alternative text for images, plots, or any type of visual element that you're including in your app. The principle of alt text is actually pretty straightforward. It's just to provide a text alternative for people who can't see an image. And the reason alt text improves accessibility is, for example, with screen readers, they're able to read out a description of what the image shows. With apps and dashboards, it's more likely to be a chart or a plot as well, perhaps exhibiting some data or a trend that you're trying to convey through the dashboard or through the data. So that brings up some new accessibility challenges, as it's harder to give alt text for a plot that you don't know the content of. With images, it's a little bit easier because they're static and you can just do it once and then it's sorted. Another reason it improves accessibility is because if an image fails to load, say you're in a cafe with bad Wi-Fi or something like that, and the image won't load, then the alt text can actually be shown in its place. So if you can't see the image or load the image, then you'll at least know what it's meant to be via the alt text. There can also be certain search engine optimization or SEO benefits via, if you actually accurately describe what an image is, then Google's gonna be able to see that, and your app or website might appear higher in the search, rather than if you didn't have any alt text, then it's going to generate some itself and it might be incorrect. So what actually makes good alt text? You might think if a picture paints 1,000 words, then alt text should be 1,000 words. And that is in fact not the case. If you've ever used a screen reader, you absolutely do not want an image of a dog to have a whole paragraph describing it. You want it to keep it descriptive, but you want it to be concise as well. If you remember that a screen reader is going to read out every single thing you put in the alt text along with everything else that's on the dashboard or on the app, then uh, it's going to take about 5 minutes if each bit of alt text is a very long paragraph. And an important thing is also to keep it within the context of why you're displaying it. So if the context, say a breed of dog pops into my head, if you just have a photo of a dog, then you might not want all the context. You might not want that it's got shaggy hair. You might not want that it's a specific breed. It's all about the context. And I do see there is a first question in the Q&A, and that's quite a long question. So I think what I'm going to do is, if you send the answers in, there is some times allocated at the end for me to go through these questions. So send them in whenever you like, as you've done so already. I have seen your question, and I'll try and get to this at the end. But yeah, another thing with alt text, we don't need to start with an image of blah blah blah. a screen reader will usually announce that it's an image already, so you don't need to say that. And again, coming back to context, something that could be imported is a cartoon of, a screenshot of, a graph of, that type of thing will be useful in certain cases, whereas an image of is likely to be pretty useless most of the time. And again, it's all about context here. So why are you showing this image, like that type of thing in your alt text? There is also two different types of text that can be included in an app. So first we've got is informative, and this is images that graphically represent concepts and information. This will typically be pictures, photos, and illustrations. The alt text should be at least a short description conveying the essential information presented by the image. Functional images are a little bit different, and the text alternative here should be if you've got a link or a button, the alt text shouldn't be all about the picture, it should be more like the functionality. So examples of this are common icons. So I think of the floppy disk for save. It could also be the printer icon to print. So if you've got a button like that, it's going to be more useful and better if you actually provide a description of what that button's going to do rather than the icon or image that you've used for that button. One thing that you can do is actually set the alt text to null or empty. So here I've got a snippet of HTML image tag with the source to the path of the image, and the alt argument is actually just empty or null. And one thing about this is most automated accessibility checkers like Google Lighthouse will actually give you a tick here. It will say you've provided alt text, this is okay. Whereas if a user was testing this and saw that you'd left the alt text here as null, then it's going to be quite useless to them. And this is not something that you should do if it's an actual image. You can use empty alt text like here in some cases, and that's if an image is only to add visual interest to the page. So if hearing what that is going to be useless to someone using a screen reader, then, for example, if you had some type of styling image, what pops in my head is like some columns or something to style an app or a dashboard or space it out, then it's not really adding anything apart from visual interest. So in that case, it's okay to provide an empty alt text. So for example, if you've got a download file button like this that says download file, then you might not actually need to provide any alt text there because it's going to read out the annotation, and hearing the alt text that says floppy disk, this will download a file, might not actually be useful because the screen reader in this case would read out button download file. So adding any alt text might just be a little bit verbose there. In a Shiny app, there's two main reasons you'll include an image in the app. So it might just be a static image with something like the image HTML tags, or we can create a static plot or a dynamic plot or a widget these days, but a plot created in R with something like the base R plot function. And the way that we'll give alt text is going to be a little bit different in each of these cases. And I've also included an example on dynamic alt text, which is something that I've made for this webinar. So alt text for charts is typically a little bit more difficult than creating alt text or writing alt text for an image. So an image of a dog, again, going back to that, is can be quite easy just because it's something static, you know exactly what you're describing. Whereas for a plot, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. So from this example plot here, what's important to read out? So to me, I think the title of the plot is always going to be pretty useful as especially with this one, it gives a little bit context of the data that's being used to create the plot, which is essential for alt text of a chart. You should be telling the user what data has been used to create this plot or chart. Also, the X and Y axes can be very useful. So here on the Y axis, we've got number of lemurs. And then on the x-axis, we've got the species of lemur. So we've got crown lemur, grey mouse lemur, and ringtail lemur. I think from this chart, what's important to convey is the counts of each lemur. So you could say there's a little under 2,500 crown lemur, just under 12,500 grey mouse lemur, or around 7,500 ringtail lemur. And you could also say there's quite a lot more grey mouse than the crown lemur, for example. And we can see if this was a static image in HTML, we could add the source to the image, so here, and then we could also add the alt text in there as well. And we can see the alt text I've added here is a bar chart titled Lemurs at the Duke Lemur Centre. On the x-axis, we've got three species of lemur: crown lemur, grey mouse lemur, and ringtail lemur. And then on the y-axis, we've got the count of the number of each species shown. And then we've got the number ranges as well that I mentioned in the last slide. And we've also got the number of crown lemurs is significantly lower than the other two species shown. So that's going to give someone who can't actually see the plot a pretty good understanding of it as well. Something that I don't think I've mentioned in the slides is it can actually be useful for a chart like this to provide the underlying data within the alt text. So actually, if it's a big plot, then the lines are a bit blurred. But if it's a summary table, a summary data table, that can be quite useful if you can't actually see the plot. If we want to include just a static image in a Shiny app, the way we do this is with tags $image, and then in here we just include the source to the image. We can include the alt text again just as an argument here, and here for this image we've got a woman staring out of a large airport window at a British Airways aeroplane. So it's going to be easier if we're just adding an image that's static. It's going to be relatively simple to just stick some alt text on there, and then this isn't going to change. It's just a static image. It's not like we've generated a plot here. We can, of course, add things like height and other arguments in there as well. When including alt text in a Shiny app, there's a few options that I'm going to display here. The first is if we have a ggplot, and these few examples are ggplots, which I'd say I use mostly for creating my Shiny. Any visualizations in a Shiny app, I'm usually going to be using ggplot. There is ways to do this for base R and other methods, plotting packages as well, but for a ggplot, in the labs function, there's actually an alt argument at the bottom here. So what you can actually do is define the alt text and then just stick it into the ggplot. This will be carried through when you render the plot in the UI of your Shiny app. And also, there's nothing stopping you just grabbing the alt text and then defining it just in the labs function. One of the drawbacks with this method is if the plot takes on other variables from the app. So say, for example, there's an app that lets you define the variables that are included in the plot, then it might be harder to include that in the alt text here. And that's where the next example here comes in. But this is a nice simple way to include some alt text in a ggplot, where you just add it as the alt argument of the labs function. So yeah, we've highlighted it in this slide. So alt is equal to a bar chart title lemurs ... where we've got the alt argument of the labs function set to the alt text that we've defined up here. And again, there's nothing stopping us just sticking that directly in the function. The other option is the render plot function has an alt argument as well. So we can include it there. And one of the benefits to define it this way is we can actually set it to a reactive element. And this means that if it includes any other inputs from the UI of the app, say in the example that I've just mentioned, where the user can decide what variables are plotted, then we can put that in this reactive chunk here, and then we've added a dynamic alt text label to our plot, which is often going to be the case when you've got a Shiny app. The plots is rarely just a static plot that you include. So adding it in there can be quite a useful thing. So here it's just the alt argument of the render plot function, and then you can stick a reactive in here, and then via this reactive you can access other inputs from the UI. So now we've got a little demo of an app with three images displayed, where one of the images is a dynamic plot with dynamic alt text. The next is just a static image, and then the last one is just a static plot. So if I run this app now, bring it over here. So this is what the app looks like. I haven't it hasn't been styled too much, but it's just for the purpose of demonstration, really. But here we've got three images. So this Old Faithful data is a dynamic plot. You might recognize this if you use Shiny a lot, because this is the default Shiny app, where if you move the slider input, you control the number of bins on the histogram that's displayed. The next image is just a image of a koala bear. It's just having a little nap in a tree. And then the last plot is our Duke Lemur Center example from before, where we've got the crown lemurs, grey mouse lemurs, and ring-tailed lemurs. So there's a few ways to actually view the alt text. So the first way would be to just open up a screen reader, but I'm not going to do that while presenting this. So the way I'd usually check for alt text in an image is to use the DevTools menu. So you might have used this before, but if not, it's the F12 button on my keyboard, which will open up the DevTools menu in a browser. But in a Shiny app, what I usually do is just right click and then go down to inspect element. This is going to open up the Elements tab, and this is going to show me the underlying HTML for the website. There's also in the top left of the DevTools menu, we've got this little mouse button. When I click this, it will let me hover over an element of the app and take me to the HTML. So if I click on our Old Faithful data example, it's going to take me to this image here in the HTML, and it says the alt here is histogram showing Old Faithful data. So that's nice and simple. Go back to the mouse, scroll down to our koala, and here we've got alt as a sleeping koala curled up in a tree, resting its head against a branch. And then again, for our last plot, we've got our Duke Lemur example from before, so I'm not going to read all that out again. But here we've got our three plots along with our three bits of alt text. And I'll show you now when I've got the app open. But the dynamic alt text that I've set up on this first plot is in this titles section. I've got some code that's going to allow me to overwrite the labels of this plot. The bit that's dynamic is the alt text here, if I go back to this plot, is currently histogram showing faithful data. And the dynamic part of this is the old faithful data is coming directly from the plot title. So if I was to set the title and to blank, I've removed the title from the plot, and the alt text up here has also went to histogram showing and then just a space. So the whatever is in this title is just goes directly onto the plot and into the alt text. So I title this histogram of the old faithful data. And that's not what it should be because it now says histogram showing histogram of the old faithful data. So maybe um, histogram of showing let's have the old faithful data with a capital T. And then it says in the alt text, histogram showing the old faithful data. So this is just a little example of how you would do some dynamic text. I'll show the code now. So I'll close this and then go over to our code, which is here. And what we've got is just a simple Old Faithful app where we've got the lemurs data and a few things defined at the top, like our template. And this is the UI of the app. So it's just a sidebar layout. We've got the sidebar panel with all of the user inputs. And then we've got our main title text input that will be used inside the alt text. And we've also got our main panel, and this is just showing our three images. So we've got the dynamic plot, the koala, and you can see we've defined for our koala, we've defined our alt text just in the image tag. So that's a nice, easy way to display that. For our static plot, we've defined it in like the first example in the slides, where we've got alt text defined within the render plot, and then we just include it in the ggplot labs function. That's again nice and easy. But then for the dynamic plot, we've got the alt as a reactive, which is just pasting together histogram showing and whatever we include in the main title user input. And then we've also got the input main title, which is controlling the title of the plot. So here we've got input dollar main title like that. And that's what's controlling the alt text that we can see. Cool. So you might also be wondering, what if you've got more dynamic plot where you want to include more information in the alt text, or you don't actually know what the plot's going to be? So how are you going to write or add alt text for that? And historically, it's been really difficult to automatically generate alt text for a plot, especially when, as I say, several things within the app that the user can change can influence what's displayed on the plot, whether it's variables, titles, even number of bins, anything like that that the user can change about a plot that's displayed. So you could add a template like this where we've got alt is equal to the glue function, which is just going to stick all the variables within our text, where it's got the number of rows, the lemurs, and then you could say it's got the count ringtail lemurs as number of ringtail lemurs. But again, you are quite limited here. If it's a bar chart where the user can select different variables, then this is going to be a bit of a pain to write some good alt text that's going to be dynamic enough. AI, I'll come on to in the next slide. There is also a package called Braylar, which has a function called capital VI, so VI capitalized, where you can pass a ggplot object and it will generate some alt text with some ranges and stuff like that. Or you could just keep it quite simple and just say this plot displays the variables, or but again, that's depending on what the plot is is almost going to be unuseful or useless to someone who can't see it. So this week, with the recent or last few years advances in AI and LLMs, there's a recent R package from Posit called Elmer, which allows you to query the popular APIs of LLMs within R. So I thought about an example using Elmer and Google Gemini because that's the free LLM at the moment to create some alt text for dynamic images that I've generated within a Shiny app. So this is now, I think, feasible thing to do, but you still need to be careful because the content is AI generated and it can make mistakes still. And there's also a few important boundaries that you should put in place if you do want to implement something like this. So if you are referring um, to the alt text of a dynamic plot, what can actually be useful is adding the actual data to the alt text, not, I mean, the whole data set, but a summary or something like that that might make up for not being able to see the plot, and it allows you to still, as a screen reader user or someone unable to see the plot, can still gain insights from that and see what it could be displaying. You also need to make sure the user is aware that the text is AI generated and may contain mistakes. This can just be precursor, I think, to the alt text. And again, coming back to context, so this is going to be really important for the users. So what's being plotted, what's the data, what type of plot of it is it? Is it a reason that you're displaying this? So less so for an interactive data dashboard, but if it's an app where you've included a plot for a reason, then that can be useful information. And the last one is alt text being generated by data or a plot or a still image. So this is something that I haven't experimented with that much, but if the method I've used to generate alt text for ggplots with an LLM is a static image file, so it might not have the context of overlapping points. So it might actually miss an important trend from the data as it's just got a static image. So actually passing the data to the LLM might alleviate this, or if you add, if there's a way to add or pass the actual plot object to the LLM, which I haven't looked into yet. But the function that I wrote, and excuse the code, I wrote this quite quickly. I think something's missing from here, but I'm just using the Elmer library and ggplot, those two packages. Um, the first bit is I'm just creating a temporary directory because I've got to save the image before I pass it to the LLM. Uh, I think I've missed out a bit at the end to delete the path, but you'll want to do that. I then just save the ggplot that's been passed in, and then I'll use the Elmer functions here. So chat Google Gemini will just open up a connection with Google Gemini LLM. I think my example's using the Gemini 2.5 Flash model. You'll obviously need any authentication as well in there. And then what you can do is pass in a prompt like this to Google Gemini. So the prompt I've used, and I didn't spend that much time engineering this, but it just says generate concise alt text for this plot image. The alt text should describe the chart type, variables, and key patterns or trends visible within the data. And then I actually added this bit retrospectively based on some feedback from a colleague, but make sure to include any value ranges in the plot, and specific is good here. So value ranges for each variable. And then I'm using this other Elmer function called image content file of the saved ggplot, which is then going to allow me to pass that image to the LLM. So this is the function that I'm using in the app. Again, I whipped up this code pretty quickly, so I wouldn't suggest that this is a best practice function or anything like that. Just a demo. So I'm going to go back to this app, and it's this next one now. So yeah, so again, I whipped up this app pretty quickly, so there's not much styling or anything. But here, I've just got a ggplot of the iris data. I'm using sepal width and sepal length by default, and then I've got a button up here that says generate alt text. Something I must add here is this isn't how you'd add alt text to the ggplot. This is an app that I've made to demonstrate how you'd create the alt text, and then I'm displaying the alt text in this app. So um, the way you do it usually is in the previous example where you pass in the reactive alt text to the render plot function. That's how you're more likely to do this in the actual app. But if I click generate alt text here, you can see at the moment I've got this preamble which says AI generated may be inaccurate and the data that I've included for the plot. So that's context. And then it does take like 7 to 10 seconds at the moment. Again, I haven't optimized this code. This is just an example, but the alt text that Google Gemini has given me back for this image is scatter plot showing sepal width versus sepal length. Sepal length ranges from 4.3 to 7.9, and sepal width ranges from 2 to 4.4. The plot displays two main clusters, one with shorter sepal lengths with the ranges and wider sepal widths with the ranges, and then another one. So it's identified these two clusters. So I actually think this alt text is pretty good. Again, it's important. We need to include AI generated just so that the user knows. But overall, I'd say it is pretty good at generating the alt text for this type of plot. If I change up one of the variables as well, say petal length here, we've got two very distinct clusters. Again, click generate and it'll take about 10 seconds to refresh. I did spend a little bit of time playing around with more complicated plots and it did again seem to um, do an all right job at generating alt text for that. It could be worth playing around with the prompt as well. As you saw, I had a pretty simple plot alt text prompt that was passing. So you could, if you want more specific things, then including that in the prompt could be useful. But here, I think that's refreshed now. Yeah, so now we've got sepal width versus petal length, and then it gives us petal length on the x-axis ranges from about 1.9 to 6.9. And then on the y-axis, it ranges from 2 to about 4.4. And again, we've got two distinct clusters. A left cluster with short petal lengths from about 1 to 2, and then um, wide sepal widths from about 2.9 to 4.4. And then a right cluster, and it described that as well. And it's also identified a slight positive correlation within the second group. So again, this is AI generated. If I click this button again on the same graph, it will give me some different alt text. So again, uh, it's important to be careful here. My app's just crashed. That's about right on time because I need to move on to some questions. But yeah, that's that's the app, and then I can actually demonstrate the app first. So again, this is the function that I've got at the moment. And then the way I've set the app up is I've just got the little generate alt text button, which is going to control when the alt text is generated. In the server, I've got an alt text blank reactive value. I've got the ggplot defined just in the server. Again, I didn't spend a lot of time on this code, so don't think that this is best practice Shiny app. I was originally going to include multiple plots, but I thought that was just overcomplicating it. So it's a bit of a Frankenstein app at the moment where I was halfway through doing something and then rolled it back. But here at the end, I've got the alt text, and all I'm doing is uh, using this reactive alt text that I've updated here, and I'm just passing our ggplot object that I've created into this function and then displaying that alt text. The other way to do it would be in this render plot. If I wanted to actually include the alt text, I'd do alt is equal to and then our alt text here or the paste. So that's what you'd actually include or how to include this alt text in the app. But yeah, we can see that my app had an issue, but it did what I wanted it to do. So I'll go back to the slides and I'm going to put up this thank you on. There is a few questions so far, so I'll have a look at them and we've got about 8 minutes left. So if anyone else has any questions, then feel free to send those in. And we've got the first question. There's a fair amount of interactive slash dynamic elements in the apps I'm learning to build. One of those elements is a tooltip that carries a lot of the data I'm able to exclude from the initial visual to minimize clutter. I understand that some of the users are probably keyboard only or touchscreen only. How does the tooltip need to adapt to ensure that it can still serve its purpose of navigating the screen under different usability scenarios? So that's quite a question that I haven't quite prepared to answer for. So you've got a tooltip and you want that to display for keyboard or touchscreen users only. So tooltips are historically a difficult thing with accessibility for the reasons that you've mentioned. So how can you access a tooltip if you're touchscreen only and you haven't touched the screen yet? It just shouldn't display. I think pre-rendering it somewhere on the screen could maybe be a solution there. For keyboard only, I guess pre-rendering it somewhere. But if you're trying to minimize visual clutter, then that might not be an ideal solution. Again, this is quite a question, so I'd have to kind of have a look at the app and see what you mean exactly to give a better answer than that. But I think that pre-rendering it somewhere on the screen might be something you could look into, but again, I'm not 100% sure on that. Another question. Um, so how to decide when an image needs the alt text versus when it should have the empty or null alt text. So the null alt text should only be used for elements that have no visual interest or oh sorry are only adding visual interest. So if it's just something for the layout or something to make it look a bit nicer that's not actually adding anything other than visual interest, then that's okay to have null alt text. But I'd say in most cases um, null alt text, if it's something that a user would find useful to see, should be included in the plot. Um, there is actually no other questions. I've seen your response. So yeah, if there's no other questions, I'm going to go back to our promo stuff. So thanks everyone for coming, and I'd like to remind you all of the events that we've got upcoming. So the main one is AI in production. I've kind of linked in with that LLM example that I've done, but the AI in production is on the 4th and 5th of June, And there'll be an email after this webinar with some discount codes if you've attended more than two, or if you'd like to inquire about this further, then um, get in contact with one of the team members and we'll be happy to help. And there's another question. If you have lots of dynamic plots and don't trust AI, is it considered okay practice to put a data table behind the chart and use the chart alt text to give title and axis labels, then refer to them in the table? Are tables generally considered fairly accessible? So yeah, that's a good question, and I would say what you said is a good alternative. So actually providing the table behind the chart or a summary of that table or summary of the data table, um, just then the user's actually got something to go off and can gain insights from that and then use the chart alt text to give title, axis, and labels. Yeah, I'd say that is a pretty good setup, and that is tables are considered accessible. Yeah, and again, don't pass the whole CSV or whole table into the alt text, but a summary giving the type of thing that you're trying to convey or might be conveyed from the plot. So if it's a bar chart, then the actual counts, it would be pretty good to put that table in, but if it's the whole underlying data set, then it might be uh, actually counterintuitive to include a massive data table in the alt text. But yeah, that's another good question. Derek, is it going to slow down the app waiting for an LM response? It could, depending on how you write the code. Like you said, asynchronous programming could be useful there, but the way I've set way Elmer works at the moment is you need to provide an PNG or image of the plot that you want to generate the text for. If you know a few of the plots that might be common, then you could always like dynamically add those. But yeah, again, I don't think I've written the code in the best possible way. And there's also with the code I've done there, I've got a button that's I've got to click. Whereas if it was just in the background, it would be a little bit faster as well. But yeah, that's another good question. Cool. So I don't think there's any more questions. So what I'm going to do is end the meeting. And again, thanks everyone for coming. Um, please get in touch if you've got any queries or interested in any of the things displayed on the screen now.